Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We have Vocab Malone back with us, and we've been talking about the Black Hebrew Israelite faith, religion, belief system, whatever you want to call it. Movement, yeah, that might be a good way to describe it. And we've had you here for 3 interviews, and we've talked a lot about what this movement believes, and now we want to get into some evaluation or analysis, some critique of their ideas. So you mentioned last time that Deuteronomy 28, verse 68 is a big deal. Mm-hmm. So why don't we start there? You said that was sort of the main core of where a lot of this goes.
That's the big daddy. Well, let's illustrate.
Before we do that, remind the audience of what that idea was. What does that verse say?
The verse, they think, gives evidence that folks who came to the Western Hemisphere via the transatlantic slave trade are the true descendants of the biblical Israelites.
Okay. All right, so that verse becomes justification. So what do you have here?
I have a children's book. Now, we've been talking about one Westers today, primarily. Yeah. I want to make sure everyone knows this is not written by a one Wester. Huldah is not a one Wester. Huldah Dawood. She does some of the gematria we mentioned earlier. I always mispronounce that. Gematria? Gematria. It's a harder G. Gematria. I always do that. But Little Judah in America. And it's interesting because they don't like J when it comes to Jesus and other stuff, but when it comes to Judah, they don't.
Oh, yeah, that's right, because what's their name for Jesus?
Well, hers is different than the one Westers, but one Westers is Yahweh-Shai.
Okay.
But then they still say Judah.
Right, okay.
So
that is a little odd, yeah.
There's a lot of these memes float around that say, the letter J didn't exist until such and such, so Jesus couldn't be his name, but they're okay when it comes to Judah. Anyways, so this is Little Judah in America, and I want to illustrate the point about Deuteronomy 28 by having Story time with Uncle Vocab. And I'm turning here to a page. I'm going to read this, and it illustrates what I'm talking about. In 70 A.D., the Romans sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. Yah warned my ancestors about these bad things at Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 68. But they did not listen. My people were forced to migrate into various parts of Africa. Finally, they were put on slave ships and scattered all over the earth, just like Deuteronomy 28, 68 foretold. And there's one of the drawings of the horrible conditions slaves were in. And then this is a big page to read right here to show it. And Yahuwah, so that's her name for Yahweh. And Yahuwah shall bring you into Egypt, and notice it has in parentheses bondage. Okay. So there's some of the...
there's that metaphorical understanding of Egypt. Yeah.
Again with ships, by the way of which I spake unto you, you shall see it no more again. And there you shall be sold into your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. And so they think that's fulfilled in the transatlantic slave trade. And I'll just read one last thing. For many years, my family who came to America on these ships were forced to work for free in terrible conditions for a cruel people. And that's sad and true and unjust, but it doesn't mean, of course, that we're talking about Israelites. Yeah. During this time, many of my family forgot their history and how important they were to Yah. They continued to break Yah's laws, and he left them here even after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. So we are still in the land of our captivity. So
that illustrates the whole Deuteronomy 28:68 thinking. Yeah.
So I thought that was important to read, and also show that they're getting into children's literature as well. And again, that's a non-one Wester. So she's female, has a prominent teaching role. Most One West camps wouldn't even allow her to do that. Okay. But she has a thing going on the internet that's pretty well known.
So when you get into a discussion about that verse, how do you critique it? How do you address it?
Well, sometimes I like to just tell them the background of Deuteronomy 28. I briefly mentioned it in a prior show, but
it's a covenant,
between a lesser power, or basically someone under subjugation of some kind, and a king or a ruler, and it's saying, here's here's what I want you to do, and here's what will happen if you don't. Here's what will happen.
Series of blessings or a series of cursings. Yeah.
The curses are longer, just like in Deuteronomy 28, and I'll just kind of speak about what is your justification for using Deuteronomy 28 in the way in which you're using it in. And honestly, usually it seems like they don't really understand the question, because what I'm trying to ask in essence is, how do you justify utilizing Deuteronomy 28 as a scriptural DNA test? Because that's kind of what they're using it for. Not literally DNA, because a lot of them discount that. Some don't, but most do. But they're kind of saying, here's how we know who the Israelites are, because they meet these conditions. And what I'm saying is, how was that what Deuteronomy 28 was ever supposed to be used for?
Right. How is that a good method to approach it? Yeah.
Exactly. So starting with the presupposition, like there's nowhere in the Bible, Mike, that says use Deuteronomy 28 to recall your identity or anything like that. It doesn't have to be woodenly that, but it doesn't give you a hint. Like, for example, people have realized certain passages in the Tanakh were messianic, and they would point those, and some they knew, some they didn't. Later, Jesus would say this one is messianic as well. But there's a lot, they kind of knew certain passages and different things. It's just, what's the justification? They like to say line upon line, precept upon precept. So sometimes I'll say, what's your precept for using Deuteronomy 28 in this way? I've never heard a good answer for why it's the justification. They just say, we meet the character of the people described in this book. So that's the first thing, is to challenge the presupposition. The whole enterprise needs to be challenged, I think, because there is no justification for it, because that's not what the passage is intended for.
It's really odd. I mean, I know that the Jews today, who the black Israelites say are not really Jews.
Imposters, yeah.
Right, they're imposters, but something like the Exodus is still fundamental to their identity. So I'm wondering how those people, the imposters, could remember this thousands of years later, but somehow, until the late 1800s, you don't have the African American community, the slave community in the South in the days, the Civil War, post-Civil War. That seems to be when, again, somebody, quote unquote, remembers this. I mean, what about all this long stretch of history, from antiquity till now? It seems like nobody was talking about this. I don't know how the imposters, it becomes part of their identity and nobody forgets it because it's just core.
Right.
And then the ones that are supposed to be the true Israelites, nobody remembers it at all until the 19th century.
I've asked similar questions, and so a few things happened. One is they point back to a book we went through earlier, which is From Babylon to Timbuktu, which gives them an alternative history, a revisionist history, that basically tries to show you all these places where this idea did pop up or was evident or was relevant.
Somebody was remembering it somewhere.
Yeah, or they'll say, here's evidence to it. They would. Some folks would challenge what you just said. Oh, that's not how it worked anyway. Yah's always had a remnant or a testimony to his people or something like that, someone might say. Another thing people do, they'll say is, well, you don't understand as a non-sympathetic, non-person of color. This is sometimes the way people approach it, how bad slavery was and how our identity and culture and language was ripped away so very thoroughly. And so a lot of the explanation lies in sort of what happened at the transatlantic slave trade, which is true, but it doesn't equal it was ripped away from a Hebraic identity, of course. It doesn't equal that. But usually it's one of those. But really, Hebrew Israelism, I view it as a restorationist movement. They're saying here was the original gospel with the original people of the book, and that's been lost this whole time, and now we need to be restored to what that was. Just like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, it's lost, and here it is again. I view Hebrew Israelism in that vein, to an extent, in my opinion, as a restorationist movement of sorts. So there's that. So that's the first thing. Another thing I'll do is I'll say, okay, before we read these curses, what do you think is one of the worst things that befell Israelites? Isn't it that they would lose their very identity of who they were? And usually they agree to some statement like that. That seems like the worst thing. And I'll say, okay, in this list of curses we're about to look at, can you show me where that curse is listed?
Oh, so the curse of losing your identity is not present in the curses.
Never even promised anywhere in Scripture. Nothing like that is ever shown in Scripture. So if we're going to look at this list of curses, can you show me where that curse specifically was mentioned? And it's not in there. So sometimes, though, what they do is go to Jeremiah 17:4. And in the CSB it says, you will on your own relinquish your inheritance. Again, they'd like the KJV rendering better, but they look at it as, hey, you're going to lose your inheritance. In Jeremiah 17:4, it's promised our identity to be stripped away. Now, the inheritance really has to do with the land and the related promises. And you can see that in other passages.
Sure.
And there in Jeremiah 17:4, you can even see it if you read through the whole passage, that it's not, because it even says right after it, that I gave you. It literally says it right after it. I will make you serve your enemies in a land you do not know. So they're losing.
There's the land element, yeah.
Yeah. And another thing about a lot of these promises of destruction have to do with Israel being removed from her land. Deuteronomy 28, the transatlantic slave trade equivalency thesis, if you want to call it something like that, meaning it requires Israelites being ripped out of their land. Well, the transatlantic slave trade, they're being ripped out of West Africa. They're not even being taken away from the land.
Right, they're not being taken away from Israel again.
Right. So I try to challenge some of the very presuppositions, but it's very difficult because they go to Jeremiah 17:4, they do this other stuff, and then start looking at some of the text. So we could turn there, and I'll show you some questions that are really good to think about. And look, if Hebrew Israelite is watching this, I hope they would think about this and say, is my understanding of this passage is it really right? Because a lot is resting on this. And so I'll show you a few of the questions that I would want to ask. One we kind of already got to in verse 68, when we'll return to that, but let me show you a few others. Verse 36, the Lord will bring you and your king, that you have appointed, to a nation neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you will worship other gods of wood and stone. So you and your king. So that's fulfilled in the pages of Scripture itself.
Sure. Yeah, history of Israel.
Yeah, it's right there.
Yeah.
You don't need to. I'll tell them sometimes. You don't need a leapfrog to the transatlantic slave trade. It's right in the pages of the Bible. Because it's interesting. A lot of their thesis depends on proving it outside of Scripture. It's it's extra biblical information supposedly to prove the Deuteronomy.
It's really odd
thesis.
because just without even looking at what happens later in the biblical story. When you have the kings, you have the monarchy, you got Saul, David, Solomon, and it splits into two, and eventually they're all carried off into exile with their kings.
Right.
Okay. But where would they say? I mean, who were the kings among them in the slave trade? I mean, how does that work? And
that's exactly what I
And when
asked.
they came over here, they didn't. As far as I know, the slave community wasn't given to idolatry. It's not like they're building idols over here. And, I mean, how do they handle that?
Well, let's return to the king thing in a second, but it's funny what you just said, where it says there you worship other gods of wood and stone. Believe it or not.
Okay.
They say the God of wood is Christians worshiping the cross, and the God of stone is Muslims worshiping the Kaaba stone in Mecca, and that's our people.
Right, but how does that happen in America, like the latter one with the Kaaba?
Well, they would just say because they're Muslims, so that's ultimately the stone god they worship, even if they're in America. They would say our people join Christianity and Islam, and that's proof. They actually view this verse as proof.
But they wouldn't lump themselves into that, would they?
No, those are people who are asleep to their identity.
Okay. Well, so when the black Israelites come over, when they're driven, we'll get back to their king with whoever this king was supposed to be, and they wind up in North America,
or Jamaica,
or any of that. So, is the reference to idolatry what they're doing? Because that seems to be the way that Deuteronomy 28 reads. That
the people who have been taken captive in this new land.
They're the ones that they become idolaters.
Exactly. Adopt the foreign religion. Christianity, worshiping the cross. Yeah. And sometimes I hear this, they'll also say, what are churches made out of?
Okay, so they're all right.
Which is wood and stone. They'll do that as well. But mainly it's the Kaaba stone, because they'll say, look at all the black converts to Islam. So the question about the king, though, is pertinent. So I'll say, who is the king? Because people just got to stop and think. Africa is a continent, and even today, it's the most diverse geographical region really in the world as far as DNA goes. Great diversity among the continent. When you look at that, and then you look at on the west coast of Africa, if you want to sort of zero in on there, because that's where a lot of the transatlantic slave trade, that's where people were kidnapped from.
Sure.
It was kidnapping, which under Old Testament law, they would have been put to death for that. But so we look at that, there's different tribal groups, different linguistic groups, different ethnicities, just all this different stuff. And different folks are getting snatched up, and if, they heard two people speaking the same language, they would separate them right away, separate families, and try to put them with people who may have been their traditional enemies or people that come from regions they don't know. My point is that there couldn't even be one king over all these people anyway, because it's a diverse set of peoples. And so who would be the king over all of them? So I guess you could say there could be a king. Every now and then I'll get a Hebrew Israelite who say, well, here's this African king who was caught up in the transatlantic slave trade. I usually am not able to validate their sources. The closest I know to anything like that, and I don't think this really is fulfillment of it, is actually a young man named Samuel Morris. But see, he wasn't caught up in the slave trade. He had a different story about how he ended up in America, but he did end up in here and became actually a young missionary. But he was a prince. I didn't explain it.
He was
a prince.
Blood, okay.
He was a prince, but he didn't come because of the transatlantic slave trade. He did come because of warring factions within his nation and linked up with missionaries and became a believer. But I'm just saying that's the only prince I know who even kind of prince royalty who came over here.
So as we wrap up this segment, they really don't have a good answer, it sounds to me.
I don't think so.
For the king element there.
I don't think so at all. And sometimes they'll say, well, you don't always have to have a king because the curses are perpetual, and not every curse happens at every punishment injunction. So kind of mildly sophisticated.
Right. So if that part doesn't work, it's okay. We don't have to have all the
If I was a Hebrew Israelite apologist, that's what I would go with.
Right.
I know we're wrapping up, so let me just show you one. Let me just show you one more.
Sure.
Verse 52 of Deuteronomy 28. They will besiege you within all your city gates until your high and fortified walls that you trust in come down throughout your land. They will besiege you within all your city gates throughout the land the Lord your God has given you. Again, that's a reference earlier to the fact that it's from the land of Israel.
Right.
But secondly, I like to say these Europeans, these Portuguese, indeed these folks in the Middle East, the Muslims involved in the slave trade, what city gates did they stomp in, and what fortified walls did they besiege?
Right. How does that description conform to what actually happened?
It happened in the Bible, didn't it?
Yeah.
It happened in the Bible.
Yeah, certainly in biblical history.
Yeah, but it didn't happen during the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
Not because there was, no kingdoms in Africa. No one's saying that. No one's saying there was no magnificent structures. There were. We're just saying, when did this happen in the transatlantic slave trade? Because that's not really.
So what's the response?
I have not heard a good one of that. I think a lot of it, I would just resort to, well, it doesn't happen all the time. But then you get to, okay, what is being fulfilled in the transatlantic slave trade then? At a certain point.
Yeah, at some point, there's enough of it that isn't being fulfilled that you got to question the whole premise.
Yeah, and again, this is important. I know we started with the children's story. Let me share one other thing. There's a platinum artist, an incredible artist. I like Christian hip hop, so I don't really sweat the secular artist, but a talented guy, sometimes flirts with a kind of a light Christian spirituality named Kendrick Lamar. Talented guy, kind of like the thinking millennials rapper. And on his last album, it was called Damn, as in D-A-M-N, as in our people are damned. That was the very thesis of the album. And this is this is platinum in a day when people don't sell records as much. And on there, he has his cousin named Carl Benai Israel, or I forgot his full name, but he used to be with IUIC. Anyways, he's leaving all these voice messages that are like teaching throughout the songs, and then sometimes the song content weaves into it. My point is, it's all Hebrew Israelism. The concept of the album title, and this is a platinum album that just came about. And here's what Carl said when he was interviewed on it. Here's why I'm saying all this. He was speaking, he was saying he was teaching Kendrick, and Kendrick's like people around him from the scriptures, how they're the people of the book. And Carl says that when he brought out Deuteronomy 28, everyone's minds were blown. He specifically said, when I brought out the Deuteronomy 28, their minds were blown. It's like that, when they saw that, they're like, wait, what? And that's exactly the reaction you get when, the people, they kind of ambush people theologically on the street and show them this, and people are like, whoa. But it's really, where's the beef?
Yeah. If you're someone who gets hit with that and you don't have any context for it, it looks like a point's being made when it really isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that with us, and I have other things I want to talk to you about, and we'll get to those in the next episode or so. But that's really interesting stuff. And again, a lot of it's new to me, and I'm sure a lot of it's new to our audience too. So thanks.
Yes, sir.
Yep. Thank you for watching Fringe Pop 321 again. Please go to our website, fringepop321.com. You can find source information for this episode and all the episodes we do. And if you're interested in supporting what we do here, go to fp321.com/S, as in the letter S, and come back and watch more episodes, because what you know may not be so.